What I want to do is to kind of generate some initial thoughts on why ESC rights are important, why constitutional recognition is important for ESC rights, and then what opportunities, how we might maximise the opportunities around the Constitutional Convention process. And the idea is just to generate some thinking for Cecilia, who's going to direct a conversation, a dialogue afterwards. So just to remind ourselves, sometimes we have to go back to base, why human rights are important. They're important because they're about human dignity, and ESC rights address the material needs that allow people to live with dignity. You know, adequate shelter, health, food, etc. And these are real issues now as we face into, as we have experienced the whole period of austerity, the effects of which are now becoming very apparent. International instruments and domestic laws are the means how we foster that human dignity, but they do remain largely symbolic unless they're activated and implemented in some meaningful way. Civil and political rights are quite strongly enshrined in most democracies, not totally, because there are many that still remain to be fulfilled. If we look at a continuum from the integrity of the individual or enslavement or something like that at one end of the continuum, and we look at the other end, say marriage equality, we're now only beginning to tackle that. So there are a lot of civil and political rights which we have and which are well enshrined in the Constitution, but there are others that we have to battle for in the future. An important reason why establishing ESC rights is important, again, is because of the indivisibility between civil and political rights and ESC rights. Without one, it's really quite impossible to avail of the other. I think the courts are a very good example of that. While you have free access to the courts, if you haven't got money, it's virtually impossible to follow that through. And governments have been very slow to concede the necessity of ESC rights, because it's about redistribution, it's about equality, and it's about widening out decision-making processes. And there's a reluctance to do that. I think that was very well demonstrated at the seminar we had in last March, when we asked the political representatives on the Constitutional Convention to respond to a need to review ESC rights protection in the Constitution. If we look at that, Sinn Féin and Labour were very much into ESC rights being strengthened within the Constitution. Perhaps there might be some concession that maybe they pay lip service to it, but really have done nothing about it. But they were fairly consistent in their view. Fianna Fáil have a more qualified view. For instance, they think that there is a need to begin to look at the right to health, access to health, and to primary health care, etc. And then Fine Gael took the view that it's the job of the Oireachtas to decide redistribution and distribution. So very different views about economic, social and cultural rights, and it does give some indication of the battle that would have to be fought. So why is constitutional recognition important? Well, as I say, civil and political rights are quite well embedded in the Irish Constitution, but they are justiciable, which is important. Some ESC rights, for instance education, is listed in the Constitution, but most of the needs that are covered under economic, social and cultural needs are covered under the directive principles of social policy. And these are there for the general guidance of the Oireachtas. They're quite benign, but they're not justiciable. They're also quite dated, and they're informed by a view of a charitable view, shall we say, of beneficence rather than social cohesion or solidarity. So they're quite dated. In addition, the judiciary in Ireland has been notably reluctant to actively interpret the Constitution, as happens in other countries. For instance, the Indian Constitution isn't all that dissimilar to the Irish Constitution, but they've had a much more liberal interpretation of the constitutional articles. Here we tend to stick to the letter of the law. I had a graph this is something that I thought might be interesting for people to talk about or to consider in the conversation. Just to maybe think a little bit about how social change happens, and ways of forcing social change. And in a way, lots of people here or in the broader civil society are concerned about equality, or combating poverty, or pushing for anti-discrimination or whatever. So basically people are operating from the same position, if you like. And if we look at ways of forcing social change, we've tried to put it up here on the flip chart because we haven't got a projector. If we look at, and all of them are relevant, but sometimes the conditions suit one particular way of working rather than another. If we look at power, like power is dependent on political and economic capital and strong organisational connectivity. And if you think about marginalised people, they don't vote in the same number, so they don't have the same political power, they're not that politically active, not well organised relative to other sectors. And I think that's something that Gary Murphy from DCU and Mike Allen have talked about in some publications, that poorer people don't produce anything that advanced capitalism prizes or treasures. They don't consume what advanced capitalism produces, so they're quite detached in many ways. If you look at persuasion as another means, and that depends on the ethical framework of the state and a robust independent civil society organisational layer. The ethical framework of the Irish state, I think, could be kind of stated as a Christian or Catholic ethos, basically that framework. It's very compassionate but conservative. And that kind of, in a way, you're dependent upon the goodwill of the state to respond or to begin to respond on that basis. But that comes unstuck when there's competition for scarce resources. And that's what's happening at the minute. And it's difficult for NGOs, when they're funding dependent, to take an independent line. We look at partnership as another means whereby social change can be forced. And there we're talking about alliances, cooperation, social movements. But if you look at the model in Ireland that has brought some sort of advances or some sort of progress, social partnerships, that's virtually collapsed. And the sector, the civil society sector, hasn't been great at creating a big tent. For some reason, Irish people find it are slower to organise and mobilise in sufficient numbers to be able to force change. And maybe it's just that we don't have good connections with political parties as they do in other countries. There are various reasons for it. But at the moment, partnership is probably very difficult. And then if we look at rights as a possibility at this time, there's a legal obligation with rights to deliver on commitments through international instruments or through domestic law. But as I say, those covenants and charters can be an influence, but they won't be implemented with any rigour unless they're just justiciable. And then finally, what the opportunity is now, I think people would recognise that there's been a significant assault on civil society or the community sector or community voluntary sector, whatever we like to call it. And that forces reflection and change of approach. Like, I'm not saying that any of these particular approaches are irrelevant, but some are more applicable at a certain time. And it may be that some of them don't carry the same currency as they did in previous times. We also have to recognise that we have a very directive state in terms of funding dependence. Empowerment and an oppositional stance is actively discouraged. Intermediaries and funded programmes have been collapsed over the past 5 or 6 years, and this very centralised managerialism has taken hold within Ireland. We're already quite a centralised state anyway. As I say, many of those working concepts have lost currency, and a rights-based approach might be appropriate to this time and might offer better chances for social change. And finally, there's precious few opportunities to input to policy mechanisms in this country and the Convention does offer a window. You don't get many opportunities. It's a fairly restricted democracy, and to a certain extent, like if you look at the Constitutional Convention process, it might in the end turn out to be a blind tunnel, but I think we have to have a go at it. In 1996 there was a Constitutional Review Group set up which came up with some quite profound changes, and that got lost in the process of the Oireachtas, and very little came out of that. But hopefully this will have a bit more traction. So it's the Constitutional Convention nonetheless is an opportunity to bring about some shift in that position, and we need to maximise that opportunity that presents itself and begin to tease out how we might do that in the following discussion.